Hey everybody, I'm Will Garcia.
And I'm Josh Earl.
And together we're the Hoops Guys. And we're coming today because Julian F left an awesome comment on one of our previous videos asking what we would do if we were running the 76ers. Well, we're going to tell you what we would do if we were running the 76ers. So, Josh, why don't you tell them a bit about the premise behind this video?
Okay, so first off, hindsight is 2020, so we're not going to tell you about what we would have done in the Hinkie era to this point, because that would, even if we did feel that way at the time, there's no way we could prove that to you, and therefore it would just seem disingenuous, even if it was ingenuous.
Yeah.
So we're going to focus on what would happen if we were put in charge of the Sixers right now, at this time, on this date.
Yep.
Yeah. So, according to Basketball Insider's Philadelphia 76ers team salary page, at the moment the Sixers are at $41,644,490 in salary.
Yep.
And the projected 2014 NBA salary cap is supposed to be $63.2 million. That's according to CBA FAQ. That would give the Sixers roughly $20.6 million in cap space at the moment.
Yep.
And that figure could actually increase because several players are on partially guaranteed or completely non-guaranteed deals at the moment, meaning if they wanted to, they could clear an additional about $3,696,397 off the books.
Yep.
If they waived all of those deals. So they're working with between $20.6 million in cap space to about $24.3 million in cap space at the moment to help facilitate trades.
And aren't they below the salary floor?
Yes, but that's not really a big issue. But yeah.
No, that's not an issue, but it just means that it doesn't really hurt them to facilitate deals with a little bit of cap space.
Not even at all. Will, why don't you tell them a little bit about the current roster?
Absolutely. So at point guard, this team has Michael Carter-Williams and Tony Wroten. Arguably their two best, I'm using air quotes, players. That's not a knock to either of those guys, but they are being tasked with the scoring load for this team. It's not working out too hot. Both of them are around 50% or below true shooting. It's pretty ugly. It's generally not working out too well for them. They are long. They are athletic. They are, interesting, sorta, but it's really not working out too great with either of those guys in the current roles that they are in, and they are really being put in way too big of a role for their skill sets.
Yes.
So at shooting guard, they have Hollis Thompson, who's an interesting sort of three-point guy. Alexei Shved, who's actually looking like a bit of an NBA player this year. Improvement. And then Jason Richardson, who isn't looking like an NBA player this year because he's not even playing.
Yeah.
At small forward, they have Robert Covington, KJ McDaniels, who, in my opinion, is probably the most interesting player on this entire roster. And then he's on a non-guaranteed deal. It's kind of interesting. We'll touch on that a bit later once we get to once we get later in the video. And then they have Jeremy Grant, who isn't really doing all that much this year, and Jakar Sampson.
Yeah.
Then at power forward, they have Luke Richard and Bob Mute, who kind of came in to be Joel Embiid's mentor. We talked about it a bit in our Sixers preview, but he is actually the person who found and sort of discovered Joel Embiid. So they have a really close sort of mentor-mentee relationship going on there. Plus, he's a really serviceable defensive wing and big.
Yeah.
So, interesting. Furkan Aldemir. I don't know much about this dude.
New addition. Yeah.
Yeah. And then Andre Kirilenko, who isn't going to be playing on this team. The center is where things get sort of interesting. With Nerlens Noel and Joel Embiid. Nerlens came in this year kind of struggling a bit to the start of the season, but to be fair, what do you expect in this sort of crazy offense where he's being tasked to do some stuff he probably shouldn't be doing? And then Joel Embiid is still injured, so he's going to be out probably for the rest of the season. And then Henry Sims, who's actually turned into a decent rotation big. Really good find for Philly, showing that he, definitely an effort guy and a motor guy who can also step out to about 15 and hit some shots and operate a bit out of the low post. So they have some interesting talent here, but for the most part, it's kind of pukey, and a lot of it doesn't really fit that well together.
Yeah, so that's kind of an overview of where the Sixers are at right now.
Yep.
And the just to mention, the salary information that we're working off of has not been updated just yet to factor in Firkin.
Yep.
So
that's a cool name.
Just let that know, but it won't change it drastically.
No.
So before we even get into what we would suggest doing, whether it be trades, looking forward to free agency or draft, we want to first discuss what would be our guiding principles for this team. What would be the things that would be pillars to our strategy?
Yep.
First off, we know that as an organization, the Sixers want to play at a fast pace with an emphasis on strong, pressure-heavy defense, primarily predicated on disruption and generating live ball turnovers, which thus feeds into more transition opportunities.
Yep.
Especially when you have young athletes who are lengthy, like they have on the roster, and when you're an underdog, actually getting in transition and generating a lot of live ball turnovers, that's going to be the best source of points that you can possibly get, because even though statistics, or analytics more rather, kind of say that if you're an underdog, you want to slow the game down and reduce the number of possessions, that thus increases the variability. That would be accurate if you're assuming that the team in question, the underdog, is capable of scoring efficiently or relatively efficiently in half court and defending relatively efficiently in half court, which isn't necessarily the case in this scenario. So causing disruption offensively or defensively, generating live ball turnovers for opponents is going to be their best avenue for success at the moment.
Yep.
And likewise, getting out in transition and feeding off of those live ball turnovers is what's going to help generate the most efficient looks for them. And then we really want to look for players that we call elevate guys.
Yes.
Players whose skill sets mesh with, complement, and elevate the skill sets and performance of the other core players, as well as, more importantly, the overall team.
Yes.
So it's not best player available. It's not, need. So it's not like, oh, we need a center, so we'll just get the best center. No, it's skill set based. And how those skill sets complement and elevate the overall team performance by fitting in and complementing the current core's skill sets.
Yeah, and one thing that would really complement the skill sets in the current core is if they can get somebody who could actually throw a rock in an ocean. The shooting on this team is pretty atrocious. According to Basketball Reference, they're dead last in three-point percentage, shooting under 30%. Let that sink in. As a team, they are shooting, that's like a Josh Smith three-point season.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's pretty bad. And that becomes an even bigger problem when your future cornerstones of the franchise, at least as currently constructed, Nerlens Noel and Joel Embiid. Both of those guys need space to operate. So it gets really cramped, and it's just generally not awesome when you don't have guys who can shoot. And another place they're sort of struggling at is shot creation. We mentioned it earlier with MCW and Tony Roten being tasked as primary shot creators. That's really not their game, but someone on the roster has to generate a shot, and they're kind of getting shoehorned into that role.
Yep.
And that's really not working out for them too hot.
Yeah. So those are the areas of need and our guiding principles. So the first thing we would look to do is kind of clear out some of the players that maybe don't particularly fit with what we're looking to do, and try to identify and get players that would fit more with what we're looking to do. One of the things that's very important in trying to get deals made is leverage.
Yes.
And what are the Sixers' selling points? What are the things that'll give them leverage with other teams? And it's that cap space flexibility.
Yes.
Being able to facilitate trades, and more importantly, being able to take on a bad contract if it also is attached with draft picks or a young prospect that you value. That's where you make your mark in terms of getting deals done. So there are a couple of deals that we thought of that we would try to get done, and we really worked hard to make sure these are realistic, and we feel we could actually convince the other team that this would be a win-win scenario.
Yep.
So the first deal is kind of a doozy, and on the surface it sounds insane to do, but it's a 3-team deal, and part of this comes from we know that the Sacramento Kings recently fired Mike Malone, at least somewhat in part due to him not agreeing with management's desire to try to acquire Josh Smith.
Yep.
And we know that Sacramento likewise is trying to get rid of some of the long-term salary that's clogging their cap a little bit, guys like Carl Landry and Jason Thompson. So using that, and we also know that Detroit is probably wanting to get rid of Josh Smith and Brandon Jennings if they can, to clear things up a little bit and to just kind of allow Stan Van Gundy some kind of clean slate. Yeah, and a wiggle room, So with all of that in mind, we came up with a deal that we feel we could sell to the Pistons and the Kings. In this deal, the 76ers would be sending out Michael Carter-Williams and Jason Richardson to the Detroit Pistons, and Tony Wroten to the Sacramento Kings. The Pistons would be sending Josh Smith to the Sacramento Kings along with Jonas Jerebko.
Yep.
And they would be sending to the Sixers Brandon Jennings and Spencer Dinwiddie. And the Kings would be sending Ray McCallum, who played college basketball in that area, to the Pistons.
Yep.
And would be sending Carl Landry, Jason Thompson, and Nick Stauskas to the Sixers. We feel we could sell the teams on this because we're taking the most onerous contracts off their books. So Sacramento, for instance, they probably would be not too incentivized to give up Nick Stauskas, but if you get them Josh Smith, the player they want, by facilitating the trade and taking on Brandon Jennings, and you clear not only Carl Landry, but also Jason Thompson off their books, and if we have to, we have a ton of second-round picks that we can use to grease the deal a little bit and maybe send a second-round pick or two to the Kings or the Pistons if they feel the need to. And all it would really entail for us giving up would be Michael Carter-Williams and Tony Wroten, who, as we mentioned, we don't necessarily dislike those guys, but they're not good fits for the roles that they're in. And we feel the value we could generate from getting two guys that we really are high on in Spencer Dinwiddie and Nick Stauskas would counterbalance and actually tip the scales in our favor with giving up two guys who are probably viewed as the two best players on the team currently. And yes, it would mean taking on Brandon Jennings, $8 million contract for this year, Carl Landry's $6.5 million contract, and Jason Thompson's $6 million contract. But we have this cap space, and we can always use the stretch provision to stretch that cap hit and the payment schedule over the next several years, which, when you factor in that the cap is going up quite highly shortly because of the new TV deal, that percentage of the cap that those contracts are going to represent for us now that we would have them is only going to get smaller over time.
Yep.
So in order to get Nick Stauskas and Spencer Dinwiddie, we would do this deal, and it would also help us kind of get rid of the Michael Carter-Williams and Tony Wroten in the wrong roles for them, and hopefully allow us to introduce new shot creators who may be a little better suited for that role.
Yep.
Will, why don't you tell them a little bit about the second deal between us and the Wizards?
Yes. So we would be sending in this deal Nerlens Noel to the Washington Wizards. And it sounds a little bit like a, what? Why would you do that? Sort of thing. But we'd be bringing in Otto Porter Jr. and Glenn Rice Jr. And they're both called Junior, so it makes them good. But in all seriousness, this team needs some shooting.
Yes.
And Otto Porter and Glenn Rice can both provide that. And Otto Porter is a really interesting 3-and-D guy.
Yes.
And putting that next to a guy like KJ McDaniels, it's really interesting down the road what you could be able to do with that on the defensive end. You know, I remember, and I'll put a link to it, I'll try to find it. It was a piece I read on Nylon Calculus a while back. I know, shocker. About how most great defenses is primarily predicated around one really solid perimeter defender, maybe
and a
two,
defensive linchpin.
Yep.
Yep.
And that's usually like a big guy. And that's really all you need. So when you can get a guy like Otto Porter who can do that, and pair him next to a guy like Embiid, who, if he can stay healthy, might be able to do something similar, that really sets a foundation for a great defense, as well as solving some of the issues on the offensive side of the ball that the Sixers have been facing. And I think that Washington would be pretty okay with this deal because their bigs are kind of injury prone and not exactly young. So I think you could sell them on a future core of Beal, Wall, and Noel. Especially,
and you can use that young core in 2016 to try and sell KD to come home and play with Wall, Beal, and Nerlens Noel.
Yep.
So once again, if need be, we could probably throw in a second, but I wouldn't feel it would. I would try to stick to just Nerlens for Otto and Glenn Rice Jr. But if need be, I would be okay with sending one of our 27 million second rounders to do that. And I know, once again, off the top, this sounds crazy because who are the three players that people think are the best players on the Sixers? Michael Carter-Williams, Nerlens Noel, and Tony Wroten. But you usually have to give up something that has value in order to get something that has value.
Yeah.
And the guys we're bringing in, we feel, bring more value to what we're trying to do than the guys that we're seeing out.
Plus, they actually fit together. There is a lot of value on this team. The problem is that it's sort of like you have a Lego, a puzzle piece, and like a
Lincoln log.
Yeah, it doesn't fit. It doesn't really go together very much at all. So, you know, if you can bring in players who might not necessarily be as good as the players we're trading out in terms of like a singular player one-on-one tournament sense, but in terms of actually fitting in with the other players to a more cohesive organizational strategy, I think that these guys fit much better.
Yep. And then we had one more deal, and it would be with the Denver Nuggets trading Jeremy Grant and a second rounder or two to the Nuggets for Eric Green and the draft rights to Nikola Jokic, who I am particularly fond of. Once again, it's kind of not a major deal, but we like what Eric Green could provide with what we're trying to do. And Nikola Jokic is a young 7-foot big man who is a very unselfish player who's got great court awareness, has a decent shot, and can really play. So when he comes over, he'd be a nice fit for what we're trying to do.
Yep.
So when you factor in those moves, we'd have to cut a couple of people. We'd have to waive a couple of people to make things work roster space-wise. So Jakar Sampson, we waive his $507,336 contract. Likewise, just because the big depth might get a little low through this process, we'd waive Robert Covington. We know he's been playing well, but we feel with the additions of Dinwiddie, Stauskas, Porter, and Rice Jr., that shooting issue would be less significant.
Yep.
So we'd also waive Robert Covington's $1 million this year. Both of those guys are on unguaranteed contracts, so it's not going to be in fact, that saves us money cap-wise. I love the guy. I know Will, at the very least, likes the guy. Andrei Kirilenko. We really tried to figure out a trade that would work well for both teams, that would make sense and would fit the collective bargaining agreement. Couldn't really come up with one, so unfortunately we'd have to waive Andrei Kirilenko, but the thought process is hopefully he'd be able to clear waivers and then he'd be able to sign with whomever he wanted, and we try to help him, along those lines if we could. And likewise, Alexei Shved just doesn't really fit with what we're trying to do and what we'll want to do. So Alexei Shved this is his final year on the deal, so we'd, waive him and buy him out. And all of that considered, we'd still have a couple of roster spots open, and we want to fill them with another big to provide some depth and a third string point guard. And looking at the D-League, there are a couple of guys that were intriguing to us. For the big, Kim Birch from UNLV.
Oh, yeah.
Would fit very well in a transition-heavy offense that also requires defensive disruption from block shots and generating steals. Yep. So he would be a guy we would try to call up from the D-League. We would give him the minimum salary for a player with 1 year of NBA or no year of NBA experience to this point, which would be $507,336. And then for the third string the third string point guard, we'd want another guy who could help space the floor. So we'd want Seth Curry, brother of Steph Curry. And his contract, because he has a year of NBA experience, would be $816,482. I mentioned those numbers because after all the trades, our total salary after the moves would be $56,927,366. So we add a lot of salary, but the salary cap, the projected salary cap for this year is $63.2 million. So we'd still have $6,272,634 in cap space for flexibility for any further trades, and also just yay, we're under the cap.
Yeah. And plus, it's not like the Sixers have guys who are like young guys who they're gonna need to re-sign soon. The thing with, especially in the Sacramento deal, those contracts, the $6 million-ish contracts on the two bigs, Landry and Thompson, they expire, presuming we don't stretch, but even if we do, they expire the same offseason that you need to re-sign, like Embiid, for example.
And like we mentioned, the cap's going to keep going up too. Yep. So it's not a big deal. The one thing I will note is we would likely stretch Brandon Jennings, just because there was an interesting thing that Stan Van Gundy said at Sloan's conference a couple years ago in regards to the going for 2-for-1.
Yeah.
And he noted that while analytically speaking, you always go 2-for-1, when you're a coach and when you're trying to build a team culture, you're trying to make sure that you're going for good shots all the time. You're trying to generate good looks. And if you're going for 2-for-1s without really factoring in whether it's a good look or something, you kind of diminish that lesson that you're trying to implement, and that core cultural element or pillar of your strategy that you're trying to put in. You weaken it a little bit. And we feel it'd be the same thing if we brought in Brandon Jennings We could probably put him in a fast transition-heavy offense and watch his numbers go up and maybe try to then flip him. But the question is, does his... And we're trying not to be overly negative. Neither of us is a particular Brandon Jennings fan, but does his propensity for bad shot selection and sometimes bad attitude, from what I've heard, does that make sense putting around these young players when you can stretch him? And regardless, we're not actively trying to get the worst pick. If we were in charge, we wouldn't be tanking. But we're not going to win this year either. Yep. We're not going to rebound and make the playoffs this year. So for Jennings, we would use the stretch provision and waive him, which would also clear another roster spot. So altogether, it would leave us with a new kind of depth chart before we even get into draft and free agency stuff, which we will address in a moment. At point guard, you'd have Spencer Dinwiddie, who 6'6", really long guy. He fits with what they're trying to do, get long athletes, and he's also versatile in the sense that he could play on or off ball, so he could play the 1 or the 2.
Yep.
And he's a really good shooter.
Yep.
And a pretty darn good shot creator, so he'd fill that role a little bit better than maybe Roten or MCW might. We'd also have Eric Green from Denver, that trade, as the backup point guard, whom, if you followed him at Virginia Tech, would realize he was killer in transition, and our team has the highest pace, and that's our philosophy, is to play transition heavy. So he'd be a great backup point guard for us. Also a very good scorer and can shoot. And then, of course, the third string point guard would be Seth Curry, who would call up from the D-League to be kind of that lights-out shooter. Will, why don't you tell them about the shooting guards?
So on the wings, particularly at the shooting guard position, we'd be sliding KJ McDaniels down to the 2, which I think worked pretty well, especially considering that the Otto Porter trade happened. You kind of have to nudge him down, but that'll be fine. He'll still be able to do what he does, block shots, run out in transition. Hopefully his three-point shot, he can work on refining that a bit. It's looking better than he did in college, although it's not quite there yet. But with other people on this roster, like Nick Stauskas, his backup, it isn't as big of a deal. Nick Stauskas is really interesting. I'm a huge fan of him. Josh is an even bigger fan of him.
It's true.
Because he can create shots and operate as a primary on-ball guy for stretches where maybe he basically played point guard at Michigan, if you really look at like the role he was put in. And he can do that, you know. And anytime you can have a guy playing on the wing who can lead the break and can run the offense as well as shoot from 75 feet, basically, that's killer. And he's also a pretty savvy team defender. So
hasn't shown it just yet on the NBA level, but rookies always struggle with that.
Yeah, and on the college level, he was pretty solid there. So he can fit into a scheme with a guy like McDaniels. Mm-hmm. And then the third string sort of wing, and this is at both positions, Hollis Thompson. He showed himself to be a pretty useful shooter, and you know, he's also kind of fits in with the whole young, long, athletic guys who can contribute that way on the defensive end. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty cool. Then I'm gonna kind of ball hog the small forwards for a second, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
Otto Porter, both of us were high on him in a couple drafts ago. Really a solid player who can defend extremely well, is a really solid process defender, can get out and run the break, which is pretty nice. Another guy who is competent handling the basketball, which is nice, and facilitating as well. Decent shooter, particularly in college, but it's carried over a bit to the NBA. So he'd be starting at the small forward spot, and he's a really hell of a player and would definitely be a big asset to that wing rotation. Then we're going to get Glenn Rice Jr. from that trade as well, and basically that's what he's going to be providing: shot creation and floor spacing, which this team desperately needs. Again, we're shooting 30% from 3 this year. That's insane. The Eastern shooting bad. So Glenn Rice Jr. can help with that.
Yeah.
More than a fair amount.
Another thing to note about that perimeter starting trio of Dinwiddie, KJ McDaniels, and Porter, all of them are 6'6" or taller.
Yep.
And all of them have longer wingspans than they are tall. So you have a perimeter trio that can switch, and any of the three can guard any of the perimeter assignments for that game. So it'd be very easy to kind of mix and match who would best fit as the defender for this particular offensive player and so forth on a nightly basis. And also, they'd be able to switch along the perimeter and make things a little easier in that regard as well.
Plus, they're all good defenders.
Yes, yeah.
On top of that, so.
Yeah, so. And then the bigs up front, just to introduce a little element of stretch for the big position, we'd probably start Carl Landry because he's a better mid-range shooter than Jason Thompson or Mbah a Moute. Mm-hmm. And of course, those two would back him up at the 4. Jason Thompson would probably be the third big, being the first guy off the bench. Most likely would be our 6th man, filling both the backup power forward and center role.
Yep.
Moute would bring that defensive-minded power forward role to bench units that are a little heavier on shooting to help hide the fact that he's not a particularly adept spacing threat at all.
Yeah.
At center, we would have Henry Sims start. Once again, that part of that is he's a little more of a shot blocker than Jason Thompson, and it allowed Jason Thompson to kind of be the leader of the veteran leader of that bench unit.
Yeah.
And then because Embiid is still injured and going to be out for the rest of the season, we would bring in Kim Birch, as we mentioned, from the D-League to provide that backup third string rim protecting presence for some of those lineups.
Yep. So that would be the roster for
the remainder
season.
Of this season.
But we're not building for this season.
Yes.
We're building for down the road. So why don't you tell them a bit about what we have planned for free agency?
Yeah, so in free agency, there are a couple of players, first off, on this new roster that we would have that would be free agents, most specifically KJ McDaniels and Glenn Rice Jr. We would try to re-sign both, especially KJ. Most emphasis on KJ McDaniels. We would also look to maybe add, no offense to Hollis Thompson, and also just to hedge our bets in case Glenn Rice Jr. signs somewhere else, we would also try to reach out for Chris Middleton, a wing for the Milwaukee Bucks, who his stock is probably a little higher right now because he hit that game winner yesterday. But generally speaking, has kind of fluctuated with Milwaukee, where sometimes he's a starter and then sometimes he's at the very end of the rotation for the wings. And he's a guy that we would actually target and try to pay more than Milwaukee would want, and try to steal him to join our core going forward. We feel he'd be a nice fit along with KJ McDaniels, Otto Porter, Dinwiddie, Stauskas, and those guys in that whole perimeter, and his skill sets would fit in well with theirs.
Yep. Now, when you look at the draft picks that the 76ers have, it's kind of obvious what they were trying to do when it comes to rebuilding. This is a team with 9 incoming second-round picks from 2015 and 2020, and that's not including the 2015 first pick that they're getting from the Miami Heat this year. So there's a lot, especially down the road. There are more draft picks than there are roster spots, basically.
Yeah.
But for this upcoming draft, that's about as far as we're going to be taking it. But they have, as mentioned, the 21st, or the first rounder for 2015 from the Miami Heat. Looking at the way things are now, that's going to be a mid pick, probably outside of the lottery, in probably that 15 to 20 range.
Yep.
As well as their own pick, which is probably going to go top 5.
Yeah.
And then they have a second round pick from the Golden State Warriors, which will probably be bottom 5. The New Orleans Pelicans, which will be mid-second round, and the Orlando Magic, which will be really early.
Mm-hmm.
So a mid-30s pick, most likely. So for the Philadelphia pick, which is probably going to go top 5, There are a couple of guys who would be more conventionally, wise to take, like Karl Towns, for example, who's a face-up big man, good post skills, decent rim protector. I think Kristaps Porzingis, similar skill set, with some three-point shooting ability and can run the floor really well. I'm liking Frank Kaminsky, though.
Yeah, and, I used to be one of these guys that would always harp on, you got to get the most draft value. If you know that guy's going to be at pick X, trade down to pick U or something and try to get it before, that pick that he should be at. I used to believe that very strongly, but in reality, you got to realize all it takes is one other team. Just one other team that likes your guy as much as you to take him before you have a chance. So it's best to, if you know a guy is your guy, take him with the pick that you have, even if everyone else is going to think you're insane. Yeah. And people would think we are insane, but we would take Frank Kaminsky with our first pick. And there's a lot of reasons behind that, and I'll let Will elaborate on Kaminsky's game more in a sec, because Will is Kaminsky's like Will's Nick Stauskas.
Yes.
So I'll let him expound on that. But for our purposes, we like how he would fit with Embiid and with the perimeter guys that we just set up through those trades. And we feel we could potentially be able to run, in terms of a half-court style offense, something a little more akin to what Dallas does, because then we would have perimeter guys who can shoot, for the most part, and hopefully KJ can continue to develop. But we'd have perimeter guys who could shoot, who can run pick and rolls. We'd have Embiid, who could be a dive man off the pick and roll, and also a post scorer who can draw double teams. And Kaminsky would essentially function like our own version of a Channing Frye.
Yep.
Or a Dirk in the Dallas scenario. Not comparing him to those players, mind you.
Kaminsky does sound like Nowitzki.
But the skill set,
yes.
The skill set would allow for very tough decisions by the defense in covering pick and rolls, either initiated by Dinwiddie, Stauskas, Eric Green, even Otto Porter, Seth Curry. Those guys running pick and rolls where even, especially like double pick and rolls or staggered pick and rolls, where you have Embiid diving to the basket, you have Kaminsky popping, and then you have those guys coming off the pick and some shooters, and if KJ is maybe cutting to the rim, that's a lot of stuff you'd have to cover defensively, and you'd have to choose your poison. So we really like how Kaminsky could be a great elevate guy for the roster, which, as we mentioned, is our preference for choosing players, is elevate guys. And I'll let Will talk a little bit about why Kaminsky is so cool and why we would take him with our top pick. Yeah,
so you mentioned Channing Frye a lot, and one of the things that's awesome about Channing Frye's game is that he can actually shoot it like a guard. And we talk about, a lot of big guys take a long time to get their shot ready, which means that by the time they can actually release it, it's contested, and it's not really as effective as it could be. Kaminsky gets it off really quick. And he's also, because he has that quick release, and because of what he can do in terms of getting that set, and plus the respect defenses have to have for him, he actually isn't bad in terms of having a good little dribble drive game, in terms of being able to operate in isolations, which is really solid. He's also really capable from the post, and he's a really underrated passer from the area as well. So he has a really diverse skill set that he can bring to the table offensively, and that gives a lot more space to guys like Embiid, for example, to be able to operate down low, or for a guy like KJ to be able to cut to the basket. It gives other people more. It gives everyone else the opportunity to do what they do a little bit easier. So that's what makes Kaminsky really awesome offensively. And then defensively, and in terms of rebounding, he's actually a solid rebounder. He isn't necessarily, knocking everyone's socks off grabbing like 10 boards per game, doing everything all crazy, but he's good. He's serviceable. And next to a guy like Embiid, who's going to gobble up a lot of boards himself, and a guy like KJ, who also gobbles up a couple of boards.
Porter, and even some of the guys like Dinwiddie.
Yeah. So the rebounding is going to be good. And what I like about Kaminsky, he's an okay rim protector. He isn't going to be great at it, but with a guy like KJ, who can come in from the weak side because he just has these huge arms and he just is great at blocking shots, both on the perimeter and in the interior, and Joel Embiid, the rim's already pretty protected. Yep. So you don't really, there's only, diminishing returns sort of comes in like a ton of bricks. And a guy like Karl Towns, for example, who's a great rim protector, he's really good at that. He isn't really going to be getting quite as many blocks, though, as he would, or contesting quite as many shots in the interior as he would in a different situation on another team, because of the way this team is constructed and the rim protection that we already have.
Yes.
So everyone else sort of has the rim protection covered, so it isn't quite as big of a deal that Kaminsky's only okay at it.
Yeah, and another thing to add too, and this is actually probably why us taking Kaminsky at this pick would be thoroughly throttled by the media and the fan base. He's a more experienced collegiate player. We have a very young roster.
Yep.
Having guys, even if it's on a collegiate level, who have some more experience is going to be beneficial for us right now and going forward. So there would be that added benefit. And once again, going back just to touch on it once more offensively, it would allow us to put Joel Embiid in the best position to become the franchise player that we think he can be by providing a 4-out style offense to allow him the most spacing to be able to become a significant threat and shot creator in the post.
You know where Dwight Howard was at his best? Orlando.
Ryan Anderson.
Hey, what a concept. And they're trying it now with Terrence Jones. Isn't working quite as well, but it's better than it was in LA, when he didn't have that. So it's a very similar situation to what Stan Van Gundy was out trying to do in terms of being able to go 4 out and helping a big man develop in the post that way. So yeah, that's why we're taking Frank the Tank.
Yep. And then with the Miami pick, which would, at the moment, it would slot in at 16th, but it'll probably be somewhere between 15 and 20. We'd be looking at a couple of guys. Bobby Portis from Arkansas. He's another guy who's a big, more of a power forward type than a center like Kaminsky, but another big who has a capable face-up game. He's not quite a three-point shooter. He's shooting a crazy percentage. Part of that is probably small sample size and something akin to like Noah Vonleh last year, which I'm still not sold on. But he has a very capable mid-range game and a good rebounder and would be a good fit, especially considering we'd want some more big depth because there would be the potential possibility of stretching Carl Landry or Jason Thompson to open up a roster spot.
Yep.
Also, another guy I'm particularly interested in, especially, once again, factoring in, we want guys who are very capable of leading the break, that fit in with being able to be, disruptive defensively due to length and instincts, and can operate both on and off ball. And there's this 6'5" point guard from Utah named Daylon Wright, who we would be very interested in with that second pick in the first round. It would be another way of continuing to have guys who can kind of all switch both offensively and defensively on the perimeter, as well as just keeping that length and size up across the board, because Dinwiddie's 6'6", Eric Green I believe is 6'4", Daylon Wright would be 6'5". That would be our point guard trio.
Yep.
And then you'd have the other wings like KJ 6'6", Porter 6'8", Glenn Rice Jr. 6'6", Nick Stauskas I believe is like 6'6" or 6'5"-ish. So there's plenty of size. And then if we got Chris Middleton, he's also like 6'8". Yeah. So we'd have a lot of size on the perimeter and shooting, and a lot of guys who could function either as the primary ball handler for stretches of time or a tertiary ball handler when the ball swings from strong to weak side.
Yep.
So he would be probably the main target for us with that Miami pick.
Yep. So then a similar player with the Orlando pick, which would be in the 35-ish range, Jerian Grant from Notre Dame. It's another similar situation where you have a 6'5" sort of ish point guard, shooting guard, combo guard, whatever they call them these days, and really skilled facilitator who functions very well as both a shot creator, but he really pushes the pace. According to Draft Express, about a quarter of his shots a quarter of his possessions come in transition, where he has over a 5-1 assist turnover ratio.
Which is very nice. Yes.
That is very, very nice indeed. So, because we're trying to push the pace, and he's also not a bad shooter. He isn't great at it, but in college for his career he's about 35%. So that isn't terrible, but he takes a lot of attempts as well, and he's been the primary focal point of that offense, and a lot of them are above the break. I took a quick peek at his shot charts. So I can understand that, he could translate to the NBA level, at least to be a reasonable shooter. So when you couple that in with the facilitation abilities, the fact that he can push the tempo extremely well, and that he's a decent defender, I think that he's a really interesting prospect to look at, who might be getting plagued a bit by senioritis from NBA front offices, but it's okay, we'll take it.
And just a note on the second round ones, as we mentioned in the trades, we're open to having to potentially move some of these second rounders, whether it be from this draft or subsequent drafts, in order to grease some of those deals that we did.
Yep.
So we're not saying specifically we would draft these guys if they were there. These are the guys we would look at if we still had that pick and we're drafting at that draft spot.
Yep. And everything's subject to change.
Yes.
So then with the 45th-ish pick from the Pelicans, two main guys that I'm looking at, and Josh seems to like them too, A.J. Hammonds and Robert Upshaw. A.J. Hammonds is from Purdue, Robert Upshaw is from Washington, and both of them are rim protectors. And that's really it. And that's fine. For A.J. Hammonds, he is averaging about 3 blocks per game in 20 minutes. And then Robert Upshaw from Washington is averaging, according to ESPN, 4.9 blocks per game in over just a little bit, or like around 19 minutes per game.
Yeah.
4.9.
Yeah.
His blocks per 40, according to sportsreference.com, 9.1. That's insane. So, can he do much else? No. But he's a rim protector, and we're going to be going 4 out. So, he's reasonably athletic, and if he can get him to run function even as like a dive man, that's kind of like the DeAndre Jordan thing.
Yep.
So that could be really valuable. And then just to touch on the last pick from Golden State, which would right now be the last pick in the draft.
Yeah.
Man, it probably will be around there at the end of the year. Caleb Tarczewski, I think, would be an interesting guy to go for. Not really a rim protector, more of a rim deterrent. You know, really good process defender and post defender, as well as a decent interior guy who can actually just makes good plays. You know, there is a lot to be said about guys who don't screw things up. Yes.
and on that note, there's you also have to remember, and once again, we were just looking at this, what we would do this year and the free agency and draft. But you also have to factor in Dario Saric is going to be coming over in a couple seasons. We would still have the draft rights to Vasily Micic, a very good, once again, a big point guard. And I don't mean big like he's fat. Not Raymond Felton. He's big, like long. Point guard who's overseas, as well as Nikola Jokic, the center I mentioned earlier with the Nuggets trade. So we'd have other young guys coming over eventually, which could help any sort of changes in the roster as we're going through. And the other thing, just like before, we'd still have tons of cap space going forward, whether to use that in free agency or in facilitating trades like we did with the Brandon Jennings, Carl Landry, Jason Thompson type deals. And we really feel like this group of players put together would be greater than the sum of their parts, and that they would complement each other well, and that especially that big perimeter, from top to bottom, big perimeter with everybody capable of shooting. KJ, capable of shooting, and also capable of breaking down a closeout defender, or generating some sort of look off of a pick and roll when the ball is swung from strong to weak side, somewhat akin to kind of how the Phoenix Suns run with that 2-point guard lineup. Only our guys would be bigger. Yeah. And, we feel like this would be a very good young core going forward that would fit very well together. And the main question mark would be Embiid. And if he can be healthy, and if he can be healthy, can he be the focal point, the centerpiece that Will and I think he can be, and who would be put in a very good position for him to succeed by having these 4-out style lineups around him, especially if we're able to get, Frank Kaminsky with that pick in the draft. We'd be able to put him in the best position to succeed, which would then help put our team in the best position to succeed. So, Julian, I hope you liked our answer to your question on what we would do if we were in charge of the Sixers. If you or anybody else who's watching disagree, or you have some of your own suggestions, or you just want to say you guys are insane for trading Nerlens, MCW, and Tony Roten,
drafting Frank Kaminsky at
4, drop that stuff in the comments. We'll more than engage in that discussion. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this video, give it a thumbs down. If you wanted to share this video on Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, wherever, feel free to do so. And if you want to be notified when our new videos drop, hit that subscribe button.
Yep.
Anything else, Will?
I think that is a wrap.
Yep. The only thing we want to leave you with is once again saying a big, big, big thank you guys for watching.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks a bunch, guys.
Take care, guys.